Greetings, friends. Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War Update for the week of June 23rd through June 29th of 2025. And if you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War Updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, comment your thoughts, share this video around, and keep being flippin' awesome. Alrighty, we're going to go straight into it. We're going to go straight into the South Donetsk direction. This seems like, where the main action's happening, despite, the main Russian objectives is Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka. But it seems like where most of the action's happening is in the South Donetsk direction. And this is where a lot of the action's happening this June. So this week, we are continuing on our Zaporizhzhia ventures. We talked about how the Russians took Zaporizhzhia, and I said, I wouldn't be surprised if the Ukrainians completely retreat behind these two rivers, the Volchka and the Molka-Yara River, which goes like this. And this week, that is what happened. The Russians have completely captured everything behind that river. Now the big question is, will the Russians cross this river and try to develop a bridgehead, like a river bridgehead on the northern side of these two, there are two villages, but they're, pretty decent-sized villages. The Ukrainians could put a bit of a good fight here in Poduvia and Myrnia. But if the Russians continue advancing in the south here and then create a bridgehead in the north here, they could put the pincers on these two and force the Ukrainians out of here. But they need to cross a river to do that. And, this gives the Ukrainians a bit of an advantage, but we shall see if the Russians could afford, it's not like a huge river. It's not like it's the Dnieper River or anything, but it is a small river, and it is something that the Russians will have to cross in order to make a bridge here. So, maybe taking, some of the, the villages of Novahasky, Tolstoya, these two small villages, I think, and this small village of Gurskia, have a small little bridgehead here, and then move southwards to start putting the squeeze on Poduvia here. But what happened this week, basically, in terms of capture, is that the Russians, first of all, continued their offensive towards the village of Yalta, and earlier this week, they captured it. And then the last thing was the village of Zirka, which was the last thing in line before the Russians had to fall back from, before the Ukrainians had to fall back from here. So, Yalta and Zirka have fallen, and because these two villages were captured, we have the Russians raising their flags here. The Ukrainians basically retreated on the other side of this river, and now they have the main Ukrainian positions are trying to hold in the villages of Poduvia and Myrnia. Right now, as we can see now, the Russians are, gearing up with their offensive to start putting the squeezes on them. Now, my guess is that the main goal here is to take everything to the south of the Volchka River. So the Volchka River continues going along this way. It conveniently forms the border between the Donetsk and Dnieper oblasts, and taking the rest of this area, part of Donbass, is very essential for the Russians. So I think the Russians will try to make a bridgehead here, and then take the villages of Poduvia and Myrnia. They'll probably make some sort of dash across these fields, try to take the village of Alexandra Cord, and reach the Volchka River here. And then from here, they'd be able to then dice up these two villages of Zolota High and Andriivko-Ketselovo here, which are actually pretty decent-sized villages. I think the village of Zelenia High has like a population of about 1,000. I think this has a population of a couple hundred. So these are decent-sized towns here. But having these will allow the Russians to accumulate forces to force the Ukrainians. So if the Ukrainians want to enter here, they'll have to cross the river, and the Russians will have some good positions to hold here. However, the Ukrainians on the other side of this river are in a height advantage because I actually have the, for the first time ever, I actually have the elevation map. I always talk about how, the two things you have to keep in mind when you talk about advances. You have to talk about, first of all, elevation. You have to talk, because if you're not strategic, if you want to take a tactical height in order to have a dominant position in this offensive, and then, you can't just advance through the lowlands, or else the enemy on the high ground will be able to take you out. And then you have to look at fortification map, which I also have, because then you'll show how you would try to bypass the fort. You wouldn't attack a fortification directly. You would try to outflank it and such, take what's least resistance. And then you also have to keep into consideration, which is when you look at the regular map, about what's the operational strategic objectives. So strategically, the Russians want to take Donbass. If they want to take Donbass, what do they have to do? Well, they have to take these towns. Now, if they want to take this major city, then they need to start taking these villages that will cut off their logistics. That's another thing, you have to look at logistics. And such. So, yeah, that is what's happening. Those are the three things that look. But when I look at the fortification map, so for example, here, this is where the Volchka River is. As you can see, it's on a bit of a low ground, and the Ukrainians are going to have a new defense line around the villages of Mizova, Prozny, and yeah. So these are two big villages, two big town cities actually, I should say. Prozhnya and Mazova. You can see it here. These are the two major, the biggest towns in the Dnipro Oblast, and they are on the high ground here. As you can see, if the Russians take everything behind this river, the Ukrainians will have very good, solid positions to have high ground advantage. So, taking Novopavlovka and such, the Russians will have to basically be moving uphill. So, it's going to be very hard for the Russians to keep moving across these open fields to try to take Prozhnya and Mazova. So, I do think the Russians won't move through these fields. I think they'll take Novopavlovka. They'll take everything behind this river. Maybe they take Ivanovka and these two towns here, Garlovka and Pitugorlovka here, just to have like some position. But I don't think the Russians will try to advance towards Prozhny or Mazova because it'll be very suicidal because it's a bunch of open fields. But anyway, and then if we look at, this is the fortification map here, and yeah, you're like, whoa, holy shit, like there's a lot of shit. Yes, all these yellow areas are trenches. I think I'm trying to. They have this is in Spanish or Italian or some shit. I can't. I don't have an English version. The person who made this is, I think, Italian. I think, maybe Spanish. But in any case, the yellow is for certain trenches, and then there's like, I think oranges are anti-tank ditches, or the yellow is barbed wire. Each of these, but anyway, what you have to know that all these things are fortification. So it's like, okay, so when we talk about the Russians, trying to go past these, advancing here, it's like, okay, well, what would be a good area for the Russians to advance towards, right? So, you see all these like fortifications, like, well, and suddenly when you look at the fortification, it's like, oh, I see why it's taken such a long time for the Russians to push from Andriivka, across these villages, is because look at all these trenches that are here, right? So there's a ton. And so, when we look at all these things, it suddenly starts making sense of why we see such all these like fortifications and such. It does look like they get rid of the fortifications once the Russians take it. Because obviously there's no fortifications here, but there's the most fortifications are along the Donetsk area. But anyway, this could give us a good example of like when we analyze the battle situation of where the Russians will go. Anyway, yeah, so Yalta and Zirka has been taken, and yeah, and now we'll see if the Russians could do that. Also, in the more south, another big thing that happened this week is the complete capture of the village of Shevchenko. The Russians started battling for this village last week. They only took the southern part, but this week we have the Russians raising their flags in various parts of the northern part, and they have captured this entire village, and they have also taken this farm between Vilinopolia and Shevchenko. So Shevchenko has fallen, and this means the Russians now have possession of the lithium mine. However, they have to push the front line many miles back in order to actually be able to use it, because right now it's on the front line, but now it's something the Ukrainians can't use as well. Along with this, this mapper has shown that the Russians are now taking a bunch of these fields to the west of Fordivka here, and this makes sense. I do think the Russians will continue trying to improve their positions between Shevchenko, Vasil, and Fordivka just to take their positions along these tree lines. The fortifications are here, and then this would allow the Russians to then advance into Mirnya from the south here. The Russians will be able to advance from Kamar here. They already have a position on the other side of this river. As you can see, there's also a, I think if you look at the fortification map in this area, you can see that, for example, if they want to cross here, there's a trench network here. There's a few trenches around Mirnya. But as you can see, this could give like, oh, so they're going to have to assault and take this trench in order to actually advance to Mirnya. If they want to take, advance on the southern part, there's a few trenches between Fordivka and Vasola, which they have to take. So this gives us a good idea of like what to look for. Anyway, in the south, so in the south and west direction, there is a lot of changes happening. And now it's just a battle for this rest of, on the other side of the Molkayar River here. So lots of good changes. And then also we have this mapper has changed to show that the Russians have completely captured the village of Novoukrayinka and Dachna. This is the first village that was taken by in the Dnipro Oblast for the Russians. Accordingly, this is because once the Russians took Yalta and took everything behind this river, they were able to cross the river and start, threatening Ukrainian positions here. But as you can see on the fortification map, I should see you can see there's a bunch of trenches here. So in order to actually fully secure Novoukrayinka and Dachna, they don't have to just take the villages. They have to take these like trench networks that are to the north of these villages. You can see them here. in this area. So if you want to take it, you have to take everything to the north here. So in order to actually fully secure it, they have to probably take the trenches that are up here. Just as in order to actually take Alexeyevka and Andreevka, they had to take the trenches that were to the north of those villages there. So, but yeah, I think the villages themselves are under Russian control because now that they've advanced so far along this river, they're able to outflank and force the Ukrainians out of here. But in order to actually fully secure these villages, they have to take the trenches that are to the north of them. But once they do that, which I think is possible, they'll be in a very solid position to keep advancing towards the village of Filia, which will then they'll advance into and get into this other river, the Solonia River, and then they can move along the Solonia River to start entering Novopavlovka. So, very big gains in the south and that's direction for the Russians here. And then now we're going to go to the Zaporizhzhia direction, where the Russians are actually activating here. The Russians have activated very fully in the Zaporizhzhia direction. And this week, most mappers have shown that half of Malinivka has fallen. Last week we had geolocate confirmation of the Russians battling in the center of Malinivka, and this week, while I don't think there was any geolocated updates, we did have some updates that the Russians have taken everything to the south here. So this doesn't make sense if they're battling for the center. The southern part probably got secured already. Where the Ukrainians had to fall back to the north here, but as you can see, if the Russians could take out the Ukrainians from the center part of the town, then there's only some small little farmhouses, not farmhouses, but little residential areas in the north here, which the Russians could quickly take. And so what the Russians are going to try to do is take everything like this. They'll have a small road that will be able to connect them to Malinivka. Obviously, they could use their motorcycles to avoid drones and all that. But once they take Malinivka, my guess is that they could go to multiple directions. Maybe this was just pinning down operations. Once they take Malinivka, they stop. I do think they're going to try to advance to the this way. Right now, the Ukrainians have a bunch of trenches to the south here because they are expecting a Russian attack directly. But if they take Malinivka and they get attacked from the side here, they could overrun the Ukrainian defenses that are in Vasovka, Zelena High, and Vasolia, and so they could take something like this. This could pull up their flank a little bit. Protect them a little bit. And then from here, I do think maybe they'll start battling for Poltavka, but I think it'll be a very bloody fight. This is a very elongated village. The Russians might take the southern part of it, but the Ukrainians will have, positions in their main fortification, Uspenivka, to start, battling for Poltavka. And, as the Russians continue moving north to Poltavka, the Ukrainians will have positions in their big trench network that's here. If you look at the trench network, I'm not going to continue flipping over back and forth because it takes time, but as you can see, there's a trench network. That's what I was talking about before. But there's a huge trench network that defends this road that supplies Glyupolia. So as the Russians want to take the northern part of Poltavka, they'll start being attacked because their flank is no longer secure. But so I do think the battle for Poltavka will take a long time, but but this does at least pull Ukrainian forces in Glyupolia and doesn't allow them to be pushed in any other direction. And then a bit more to this area, the Russians are activated again in the Orekov direction. And this week, the Russians made a lot of rapid progress. This week, we had a geolocate confirmation of the Russians being in the eastern part of Mala-Takhmachka, in this near this soccer field, this area right here. The main Ukrainian defense is this prison colony, I believe. The Russians are not in control of it; they are bombing it, and they need to take over this prison colony if they actually want to have a firm, secure position in Mala-Takhmachka. That is the only way they'll be able to hold on. So because if they could hold on to the eastern part of Mala-Takhmachka, but if the Ukrainians hold a major fortification here, they'd be able to push them out like they did before. But taking the most east, about 30% of Mala-Takhmachka is a very solid goal for the Russians. I'm interested to see how the battle for this Mala-Takhmachka prison colony goes. But it does make sense for the Russians can now accumulate forces here and try to storm this prison colony. So yeah, if they could take the prison colony and all that, then they could probably break the Ukrainian defenses, everything behind this tree line, and try to continue pushing along this river here, that kind of separate the Konyak River, and then they could continue moving and then moving across this residential area and so forth. And this would give the Russians a very solid gain to the flank of Orekov here. And then a bit more to the western direction, the Russians are also active in this area, and the Russians are making a lot of solid progress. This week we had geolocate confirmation of the Russians being in the northern part of Kamyanska. Kamyansk is a pretty decent-sized town. As you can see, then it expands this way. There's a bunch of residential areas very much to the north here and kind of bleeds up here. The Russians aren't here, but they are in the most center northern part of Kamyanska. But this shows that everything to the south of this river has come under Russian control. Before we didn't know if the Russians were there or not, but now we know that they are, and we actually have the Russians raising their flags in the center part of Kupyansk. That doesn't mean the village is like here. There's still a lot more work to do for Kupyansk, but I do think one of the major goals for the Russians is to take Kupyansk, take a bunch of these fields here, and then secure their flank here. The Ukrainians will retreat back to their next defenses in the village of Seversk here, and then I think that will help the Russians, pull up their flank a little bit as they start trying to outflank Kharkov here. So that is what's happening in that direction. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Pokrovsk direction, and in the Pokrovsk direction, we're getting some very interesting updates. One of the biggest updates is that right now the Russians are making very much advancements into the village of Udachna. The Russians are renewing their focus to try to retake it. Remember, the Russians did enter it earlier this year. However, when the Ukrainians did their multiple counterattacks in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians had to fall back from Udachna. But now they are trying to regain their positions here and actually try to capture this village. The biggest thing that's happening in the Pokrovsk direction is that the Russians have taken all these fields that are to the north of Novosibirsk after they captured this village. There is a fortification that you actually could see on this map here, actually, even... you can see it right here. Yeah, this looks like I don't even know, but you can see this borders the Dnieper and Donetsk oblasts here, and I think the Russians are going to have to take it in order to actually have a foothold here, just to secure their just to have a foothold here and not have the Ukrainians accumulate troops here. But the Russians are now advancing north of Novosibirsk and are now taking all these fields that are to the south of Udachna. And I have no doubts that the Russians are going to probably do some sort of major offensive to try to take everything behind the rail line here, take southern Udachna. The Russians all made some small progress in the eastern part of Udachna, taking some small parts here. So I do think the Russians are going to make advancements up here or try to take the southern part of Udachna, and there's probably going to be a major battle for the major rail station that's in the center of Udachna, because if the Ukrainians lose the center, this giant railway station in Udachna, then the Russians will basically take the rest of Udachna. So a lot of good work going on in that area for the Russians, and right now the main Russian goal is to take Udachna and just secure their western flank a little bit as they start encircling Pokrovsk. And then also a little bit more here, the Russians are made some small progress to the north of Shevchenko and Pishana, and I don't know why they didn't do this earlier, but they did finally take this area right here. So there's this kind of rail line that kind of splits in half here. But, the Russians are in Shevchenko, but they never moved north to have a forward operating position so that, if the Ukrainians try to advance here, then the Russians have a forward position to at least slow them down before they can reach Shevchenko. Because before, the Ukrainians were able to hold on to here and then just send troops directly into Shevchenko. And, they got destroyed, but, it's very much better if the Ukrainians don't continue entering Shevchenko. So the Russians capturing this rail line is a very good gain for the Russians. And I do think maybe the next goal for the Russians is probably take this kind of dominant height, this Terrakon here in Zirka, and finally finish taking this village. And this would, help, put the Russians closer and closer to Pokrovsk here. Now, where the Russians are making, this is where, what's most interesting here, and as I said, when I go here, I split the Pokrovsk and Kostiantynivka directions by this highway. So everything behind this highway, I kind of consider part of the Pokrovsk direction. Now, there's been some very interesting updates happening here, but we don't have any geolocated confirmation of that. According to a bunch of pro-Russian sources, the Russians are already battling for the village of Novotoretska, for the village of Razny, and are even in the northern part of Novokodomichnya here. And so we don't have any geolocated confirmation of that yet. So I don't know exactly what's going on, but a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that the Russians are already almost in control of Novotoretsk and Razny, at least, and have positions in the northern part of Novokodomichnya. This is very big news if it's true, but we don't have any confirmation yet. So I'm not saying it happened yet, but these are the things swirling around. It's not just one person saying it; it's a bunch of different Russian sources saying it. But what this mapper has shown is that the Russians have expanded their presence around this area, taking these fields to the north of Kopany here, Kopatachi here, taking some more parts in Myrnia. I still have no clue why the Russians aren't. I think probably the Russians already controlled Myrnia, but probably got completely destroyed and they can't hold on to it. But this map shows that the Russians are advancing along this highway, trying to reach Nikolaevka here. But I do think the Russians probably are in control of Myrnia and all that and such. But the main thing for the Russians is to take Novotoretska, Razny, and such, and then because if they could take these villages here, then the Russians will have a very solid position to start trying to outflank Pokrovsk and Leningrad from the north here. From here, the Russians have various options. The Russians could, they could maybe forego trying to take these villages, Sokovka and such, but the Ukrainians will then kind of have their northern, their northern flank would be exposed if they start trying to advance towards Rodonsky to try to cut the major road of life to Pokrovsk and Leningrad. So maybe they continue advancing northwards here and try to take it, or maybe they reach this water reservoir here, take something like this. I do think even if they just take something like this would give the Russians a very solid position, and then we'll see what happens. But right now we have to wait for it. But if they do reach this position, there's a lot of defenses the Ukrainians have. As you can see, if they try to advance here, the Ukrainians have a river in Novokodomichnia. There's an electrical substation. There's huge Terrakon to defend themselves if they want to just directly move here. If they want to move a little bit to the north here, as you can see, the Ukrainians have the big town of Rodzny with the Terrakon and this industrial mining complex. So if the Russians want to move to a bit more north here, this will, they'll have to. There's another big defense here. And so I do think what the Russians will probably try to do is probably just move along this area and reach this rail line here, and then try to probably just do assault operations, just, use this huge flanking operation, try to get a foothold in northern Kodomichnia, probably try to storm this Terrakon, probably, reach the border of these two reservoirs, water reservoirs, and then, maybe do assault operations to take this mining complex. So then there'll be a very bloody battle for the town of Rodonsky here, and the Ukrainians will probably put a very big fight for it. And again, if they start doing that, then their entire northern flank is exposed. The Ukrainians could put up troops in Belitsky, in Shalkovka here, and so it's going to be very, very tough for the Russians. I think what the Russians will have to do is finish the battles for Polpa Yar, Poltavka, and Rusin Yar, and maybe do a big operation to try to move towards the village of Shalkovka here, and take something like this. If they could take this, then they actually have their flank is a lot more secure, and they're able to actually battle for Rodinsky. But there's a lot more that needs, and the Ukrainians put a bunch of troops here, so it's not going to be an easy goal, easy operation, but it is something the Russians are doing. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Kostiantynivka direction, and this week, before we go to the Kostiantynivka direction, there's been some more changes in the Pokrovsk direction. Apparently, according to some mappers, the Russians are improving their position to the north of Gorivka and to the west of Mirolubovka here, taking this tree line here. If you look at the map here, there's a small little zone here, and I think the Russians could be in a very good position if they could manage to take it, because then they'll have a small position, and on the other side of the river here. And if they can take something like this, the Russians will have a small outpost as they start, as they get closer and closer to Leningrad here. But we shall see how that develops, though. So just some small changes. The Russians took this tree line and took this tree line to the north of Gorivka. But now the main goal is to try to take this kind of small little zone that the Russians could use to accumulate forces. Okay, now we're going to go to the Kostiantynivka direction, and there's actually not been as much changes in the Kostiantynivka direction, mostly in Chasov Yar, actually, so we're going to go there in a moment. The only big changes here is that the Russians are making some small progress from Romanovka towards Katarinivka. Most sources are saying that the Russians have taken some more of these tree lines, just getting closer towards Katarinivka. Last week they cut sources say that it's true that they took Alexander Kalinovo and managed to cut the highway between Katarinivka and Yablunovka here. This will be a very good gain for the Russians, but we shall see. That's what happened last week. So the Russians are slowly but surely trying to split these defenses in half. Along with this, the Russians made some progress to the north of Yablunovka here and have captured some more of these areas to the north here. You might be wondering why it's taking so long to take Yablunovka, and for that, I'm actually going to be going to the fortification map. And here's the fortification map, and now everything makes sense, right? So you might be wondering, why don't they just continue advancing along Lubunovka? Well, because the Ukrainians have a bunch of these fortifications to the north of the village, And so if the Russians try to reach this area, the Russians I think only took this area right here, and so but there's still a bunch of trench networks that the Ukrainians could use to attack the Russians. So that's why it's taken such a long time to try to push the Russians out from the Ukrainians out of Lyublyanovka here. So this explains why it's taken such a long time for the Russians to battle for Lyublyanovka, because there's all these trenches here in the north. This is why having the trench map is very important, because it gives you an idea of like, well, why is there something important and all that? Why is it taking so long? Why are they doing this or that? So it gives us a better position, like a better understanding. In the kind of more Tourette's direction, we have 100% confirmation the Russians are in complete control of Lyublyanovka. We have the Russians raising their flags on the most northern part here, so that's very good. We also have some geolocated confirmation of the Russians battling for these tree lines here, just improving their positions to the south, or I guess southeast would it be, of Bilohora. I do think the Russians are going to finally enter this village. Bilohora is just a bunch of residential houses here. There's nothing big here, and such. The main goal for the Russians is to take Alexander, but I think that is still a little bit. The Russians have to improve their things here a little bit before they could take that village. But right now, I think the Russians are right now improving their positions. Taking Dolinovka by we finally have geolocated confirmation that improving their positions. Everything behind, kind of on the other side of this canal here, and once they're able to do that, then they'll be able to start assault operations on Bilohora. So just some small operations there. And then where the Russians are making the most progress is actually in Chasov Yar. The Russians are making very much, this week, according to the mappers, is that the Russians actually have complete control of this micro-district right here. This makes sense because the Russians were already in control of these kind of quarries, this quarry right here, this quarry right here, also in Stupichki. So the Russians are making very solid progress here, and being in control of these high-rise buildings and these and everything will give the Russians a very good area to accumulate forces. So taking this was a very big boon for the Russians. We don't have any geolocated confirmation of that, but most pro-Russian and neutral mappers show that this micro-district was taken by the Russians. We also have sources showing that everything, because of that, the Russians have taken more of this residential area. The mapper also says that this area of the residential area, which was put under Russian control, is actually under Ukrainian control. This makes sense because Ukrainians have a bunch of positions in this forest right here. The Russians have been bombing this forest relentlessly, and I think the only way they were able to dislodge from this forest and actually be able to fully secure the center of Chasov Yar probably is if they could take the rest of this. If they could somehow maybe move south from the positions in the northern part here, try to take just this area from the most western part of this forest, and then the Russians could then move, and try to cut this forest in half. And the main goal is to take something like this. Once they take everything behind this red line, let me just draw it here like this. Then they can actually say they've fully taken Chasov Yar. So. The Russians are, since they captured this, they are in a very good position to continue advancing here. The only other thing the Russians have to take is this northern part of Stupichki, this area right here, there's some high-rise buildings, some residential areas. The thing is that the Ukrainians have a bunch of trenches here, but the Russians will be able to take it. So I do think the Russians are going to start advancing towards, this area, try to take, this area, and then from here, with their positions in southern Stupichki, be able to take this other residential area here, this other micro-district here. So the main goal for the Russians is to take everything like this. Once they have everything behind this red line, they'll be able to actually fully secure Chasov Yar. So once they do that, I think then the Russians will try to help the Russians in the southern part here try to liquidate this pocket between Chasov Yar and the Touretsk area. And then if they could, say take this forest right here, and such, then the Russians will be able to then start taking Alexander Chutili, and then you could see from this point the Russians will have solid positions to be able to have to reach the southern outskirts of Kostiantynivka here. So that'll be a very good boon for the Russians here. Anyway, and then also a bit more to the north of Chasov Yar, the Russians are very strongly improving their positions here. The Russians have completely reached the canal in Gridukra here. They finally did it. I don't know why it took so while, but probably because there's a bunch of trenches that were here. But I think it seems like the Russians are finally taken it, and they have taken this area between Gorivka and this quarry here, this area right here. So the Russians are making very solid progress in the northern part of Chasov Yar. I do think they're going to stop here. I don't think the Russians are going to try to take Markovka, Masivki here. In the future, yes, but I don't think the Russians are going to be putting more forces to the north here. I think now that they've reached the canal and have taken this quarry, that the Russians will have, solid positions to just hold off the Ukrainians from this area so they could continue focusing on the southern part of Chasov Yar. So we shall see how that develops. Alrighty, now we are going to go to the Seversk direction, and there's been some small changes in the Seversk direction. The main thing is that this map has finally been updated and shows that the Russians are now battling for the center of Shevchenko. As you can see, this village has also been reduced to ruins, but most sources show that we had actually a GLK confirmation of the Russians being at least here. So everything to the most eastern part of Shevchenko has been taken by the Russians. But this map shows that the Russians are now battling for the center part of the village, which makes sense. Now, I do think the Russians will take Shevchenko, but I think they'll have to stop at that point. I think the Russians will be able to take, everything like this, take the rest of this hill. But what's happening is now that the Russians have not secured the northern part of this Shevchenko forest as much as they think, and so the Ukrainians could accumulate forces in this forest and start attacking the Russians. And apparently, a lot of the Russian sources are saying that this is actually starting to slow down operations in Shevchenko because the Russians are, getting attacked from across the river. Now, the river provides some defense, but if the Russians want to outflank Seversk from the north here, if they want to use Shevchenko as a launching pad to start, taking in this area, take Dontesk to cut off, to start encircling Seversk from the north, they're going to have to do something about this kind of area in the Shevchenko forest here. So as long as the Russians are slowed down in this area, in Torskoye, where they've not been able to break through, I think the Russians are going to have a much more harder time in Seversk to actually cut off Seversk from the north. I do think they'll be able to take Shevchenko, but it'll be very hard for the Russians to continue their offensive to envelop Seversk from the north. And now this is where I'm going to actually go to the elevation map here, because it actually helps a lot. Everything here is in Russian, so it's hard to put here, but let me see if I could get a good idea. Here it is. This is Seversk here. So as you can see, this is Seversk, and if we kind of go to the here, as you can see, this is Verkhomanska. This is Bill. So as you can see, the Russians are advancing in Grigorivka, Shevchenko. But as you can see, you might be wondering, well, why do I always harp on that they have to take this hill to the south here? Well, because as you can see, this has a higher elevation. If you can compare it here, this is about 214 meters, maybe 220 meters or so. And then in the bottom here, as they move across these villages, it's literally 50 meters. So there's like a 200 meter, almost like 200 meter height difference between here. So they have to take these hills here. Same thing here. As you can see, there's hills to the south of Verkhomanska they have to take, which the Russians are trying to do, by the way. That's why I said they have to take these areas before they could take these villages. And because the Russians have been able to take most of this, I think the only thing that's in the high ground left is this area. But if the Russians could take this, then they could actually secure Grigorivka and Shevchenko. That's why the Russians were able to break through here for such a long time, because they didn't have the tactical height advantage. But now that they have that, they're making some good solid progress. Along with this, this map shows that the Russians are moving across this reservoir, taking more and more of this area to the north west of Verkhomanska. So that's some solid news for the Russians. The Ukrainians have a bunch of trench networks right in the front of Seversk here. A bunch of trenches here. So I don't think there's going to be a direct attack from this area. I do think the Russians are going to try to, do encirclement advances here. But I do think advancements here are just to, take some more of these fields to the south here, just so the Russians could finally, when they take Shevchenko, they could take something like this. Take everything behind this red line here, and then they'll be able to accumulate forces here to start encircling Seversk from the north here. So I think this is just to help the northern advance here, not actually to attack Seversk directly. Alrighty, now we're going to go to the Lyman direction, and in the Lyman direction, we actually have good news for the Ukrainians and good news for the Russians here. So this is where both things are happening. The main thing is that the Ukrainians are making counterattacks here. So this explains why the Russians made a bunch of slowdowns in the Lyman direction. It seems like the Ukrainians put a bunch of troops here, are now making a bunch of advancements here. The biggest thing is the Ukrainians are now are right back in the village of Rikadup. We don't have any GLK confirmation of that, but even pro-Russian sources admit that the Ukrainians are at least in the most western part of the town. And I do think, and now the battle for Rikadup is re-ongoing. We shall see if the Ukrainians could push the Russians fully out of Rikadup. If they could take Rikadup, then that means the Russian positions are as they're trying to push Novomiriya and Glushakovka and Kharkovka are going to be completely disengaged, and the Russians will have to retreat back to Novi and this area right here. Rikadup was a very, was something the Russians really had to take in order to, continue their offensive trying to encircle Lyman. But the Ukrainians put Azov here, and now they're battling for Rikadup again. So because of that, the Russians also now have geolocated confirmation. The Russians are completely out from the most western part of Kharkov. We got geolocated confirmation of that last time. I think also the Russians probably retreated from the most eastern part of Kharkov and are now back. Just kind of back in Rikadup here. So I think the Russians are completely pushed back from Kharkov. So, before we were talking about if the Russians are going to get Kharkov and Zelina Dolina, they can continue pushing towards Shendo-Rilakovko and start trying to encircle Lyman from the north. But now it seems like they're getting pushed back and the progress is getting reversed. But if the Russians could push the Ukrainians out of Rikadup and fully secure this village again, then they could actually hold on to their positions on the other side of Kharkov and such. So, yeah, the Ukrainians are making some decent progress here along with this, but the Russians are also making some small progress here. They've taken some more fields to the south of Zelina Dolina. Accordingly, apparently, the eastern part of Zelina Dolina has been taken. I have no clue why they're not able to take the village fully. I do think the Russians will take Zelina Dolina and take it like this. But once they take it, then everything will hinge on Rikadup, because then if Rikadup falls, the Russians will have to fall back to Novi, and then Russian positions in Zelina Dolina could be could be attacked from the north, and this would be a very bad day for the Russians here. But it does seem like the Russians think they're going to be able to push the Ukrainians out of Rikadup again, so we shall see how that goes. But in better news for the Russians in the Lyman direction is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Girkivka. We have the Russians raising their flags in this area here. There's a bunch of trench networks. I'm not going to continue flipping over, but there's a bunch of trenches that are here. And so this does hold up the Russians a little bit, and this probably explains why the Russians were advancing towards Novomirnya, because they're probably trying to outflank this trench network here. So in order to actually fully secure Girkivka, I do think the Russians will have to do some sort of outflanking maneuvers to try to take these trenches that are here, and then take something like this. If they could take something like this behind this red line, the Russians will secure their northern flank a little bit and actually secure one of the last villages they had to take in the Luhansk Oblast. So yeah. Now we are going to go to the Kupyansk direction, and in the Kupyansk direction, there's been a lot of interesting changes. The biggest thing is, according to this, there's been no geolocated confirmation. This is just something the Russians claim, is that they have completely captured the village of Novokuratovka here. This makes sense. We did have geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians being attacked here, so it is, before this was under Russian control here. Maybe this was like a Ukrainian reconnaissance and force that entered here and they got bombed. So maybe it's not it's not actually a fully secure Ukrainian position. So it's not impossible for Novokuratovka to be taken, especially if the Russian forces in Lazova and Zirka are still secure. But if Novokuratovka is taken, this would allow the Russians to kind of defend their positions along this reservoir here, and then protect the southern flank here, because it does seem like the Russians kind of stopped their offensive towards Borova here. I don't think the Russians are going to advance here they haven't advanced here in months. So we shall see how that develops here. No, we have no geolocated confirmation of the Russians raising their flags or anything or being in Novokuratovka, but that is something they've claimed, and if that is the case, then the Russians will be able to be in a better position here. Because last week when the Ukrainians broke through here, I was like, oh, the Russian positions in the south here are a bit more tenuous, but we shall see how that develops. We have to get more geolocated confirmation to know the true positions in the southern part of this Krulatovka salient. And then a bit more to the north here, we actually have geolocated confirmation the Russians are back. Before the Ukrainians did a counteroffensive to try to push the Russians out from the southern part, from this area, and they managed to push the Russians mostly out of Klonosovka here. But this week we had geolocated confirmation that the Russians not only were in control of this village, they actually entered the next village of Gludovsky here. They actually were in the southern part of this village. So most sources are saying they took this forest here, and they're now in the southern part of this village. So very, very good gain for the Russians here. And so we shall see the Russians expand their positions here. We shall see. This just showed that this salient around Krulatovka, which was seemingly being very tenuous, is now a bit more secure. If they could take Novokuratovka and Gluzhovki, say something like this, and something like this, then you could see the salient becomes a lot more firmer, and it'll be a lot more harder for the Ukrainians to push the Russians out of the salient. And then a bit more to the north of Kupyansk in this kind of Dorichnia bridgehead here, we actually had most map updates, and I think even I think we had GLK confirmation. I need to double check, but we actually have sources showing that the Russians have completely captured the village of Glubovka, or at least being in this area. So if the Russians are in this area, this shows that I do think it's very much possible that the Russians have completely captured the village of Kondrasovka and Radivka here, which they claim they have, but before I thought that they were just over-exaggerating their positions here. But it does show that, but if they are already in these fields to the south here, we actually also have the Ukrainians bombing a bridge here. So this shows that the Russians are, in these, are more in these fields to the east here. So, I do think still that, the Russians claim they took the village of Moskovka here in this, this western village to the west of Kupyansk, but I think that's baloney. I don't think the Russians are there, but I do think the Russians have improved their positions here a lot more and are now in this area here. So even if they just took this, I do think before the Russians continue battling for Kupyansk, they have to continue take more of these areas to the north in their Dorichnia bridgehead, because right now it's very tenuous. I feel like they're trying to take Kupyansk, but it's very much they're trying, in order to take Kupyansk, you have to improve your bridgehead, because if you don't improve your bridgehead, then the Ukrainians have a lot of positions to be able to start attacking your as you try to advance into Kupyansk, and you have to improve your bridgehead here and actually to have a good chance here. So I think if I was the Russian commander, once I took these two villages, I would stop. Maybe have take some positions in the northern part of Kupyansk, but I wouldn't continue advancing here until I secured my flank a little bit. Take Monochernivka, Mala Shapraki, Velika Shapraki, Dorsovka. Just improve their positions here a little bit to the north here and such. Alrighty, that is the Kupyansk direction. Now we're going to go to the Kharkov direction. There's actually been some changes here that we actually see. This week we had the Russians crossing the river here. We had GLK confirmation of the Russians being bombed in this area right in the north here. We got a lot of sources are saying the Russians have crossed this area in force, or are now entering this this forest here. In the other side of this Seversk River, and we actually have the Russians bombing the hell out of this industrial zone here, and accordingly the Russians are trying to take control of this industrial zone. Now we have the Russians bombing this to hell. We have the Russians actually being droned on the other side of this river. We have map updates showing that this forest is now being taken by the Russians here. So it does show that the Russians, now that they took the northern part of Volchansk, is now they're trying to secure the southern part. So we shall see how that goes. Maybe they get pushed back. The Russian forces here have been very, very slow, but, what can you do? In any case, I do think that the thing is that if the Russians do manage to control this industrial zone and manage to actually take something like this, then I think this kind of spells doom for the rest of Volchansk, because that is one of the biggest defensive positions in Volchansk besides the river. And if the Russians then they'll have a very solid bridgehead on the other side of the Seversk River, and then the Ukrainians will have to fall back to this high-rise building area to the southern part of Volchansk, but. It's going to be very hard for the Russians to be able to take it. So, but I don't think it's automatic. The Volchansk won't automatically fall to the Russians, but I do think if the Russians could take the industrial zone, this will give them a better position to have a bridgehead to take the rest of Volchansk. Because I thought once they took the northern part of Volchansk, they'll just settle in along the Seversk River, but apparently there's some more things going on there. And then we are now going to go to the Sumy direction. There's actually not been that much changes, just been some back and forths. Last week we talked about how the Ukrainians completely captured the village of Andriivka, but this week we actually had JLA confirmation of the Russians being droned in the most northern part of Andriivka. But we also had Ukrainians being bombed in these fields to the south here. So it does show that Andriivka is still being contested. Maybe it's a bit of a gray zone. We don't know who exactly is in control of what. So we shall see how that goes. But Andriivka is still being contested, and we also have some GLK confirmation that the Ukrainians were bombing this bridge in the central part of Yunatovka to deny it to the Russians. So this does prove that the Russians are at least in the center part of Yunatovka. So some small changes happening there, but it seems like the Russian Sumy offensive has kind of slowed down drastically here. But at least now, so we shall see how that develops. And that is the end of this video. Hope you guys enjoyed this weekly Russian-Ukrainian war update. Be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian war updates. Be sure to like this video, comment your thoughts, share this video around, keep being awesome, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.